In 1474, in Basel, Switzerland, a rooster was put on trial, found guilty, and burned at the stake. The charge? Laying an egg. A century earlier, in a French town square, a pig was hanged in front of a crowd for the murder of a child. And in one court, a swarm of rats was formally summoned to answer for eating the barley, and when they didn't show up, the judge appointed them a defense lawyer. None of this is a myth or a story that grew in the telling. It's in the court records. For hundreds of years, medieval Europe put animals on trial like criminals, and today we're going to find out why. Let's start with how common this was, because that's the first surprise. This wasn't one strange judge having a bad day. Historians have cataloged around 200 separate cases of animals being prosecuted across Europe over several centuries. The definitive collection was put together more than 100 years ago by a scholar named E.P. Evans, and it's still where everyone starts. And those cases split into two very different kinds of trial. One was for a single animal that had hurt someone. The other went after whole swarms of them. We'll take the single animals first because that's where the pigs come in. And it was almost always pigs. Once you know why, it makes a grim sort of sense. Medieval pigs weren't the penned, pink animals you're picturing. They were half-wild, lean, bad-tempered things turned loose to roam the streets and root through the muck for scraps. They were everywhere. And in a village where babies were left in a cradle while the adults worked the fields, a large, hungry animal with no fence between it and the child was a real danger. Pigs attacked people. Sometimes they killed them. So when a community wanted justice, the pig was the one in the dock. The most famous case comes from Falaise, in northern France, in 1386. A sow was accused of killing an infant, and the town did not treat it lightly. She was tried, convicted, and sentenced to be dragged through the streets and hanged in the public square. And we don't just have a legend here. We have the executioner's bill, an actual receipt, recording that he was paid for the job. Now, the story goes that the sow was dressed in human clothes for her execution, a little waistcoat, gloves, even a mask. And that's where I have to be honest with you. That detail comes from a painting on a church wall that was whitewashed over centuries ago, not from the original record. So treat the costume as a good story, not a proven fact. The hanging itself, though, absolutely happened. And here's the case that tells you these were real trials, not mob justice. In 1457, in a French village called Savigny, a sow was tried for killing and partly eating a 5-year-old boy. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. But she hadn't been alone. Her 6 piglets had been found at the scene, spattered with blood, and they were charged too. And this is the part that stops people. The court looked at the piglets, and it let them go. The reasoning was that they were young, they were only following their mother, and there was no proof they'd taken part. 6 baby pigs, acquitted on a point of law about intent. That is not a mob with pitchforks. That is a courtroom. So here's where it gets genuinely strange, because the deeper you go, the more serious it looks. These animals were held in the same jail as human prisoners, carried to court in a cart, and the executioner was paid the same rate he'd get for a person. In the bigger cases, there were lawyers on both sides, sometimes even a defender appointed to speak for the animal. Same courts, same judges, same procedures they used on people. Nobody involved was treating it as a joke. Which brings us to the obvious question. Why? What could anyone possibly gain from hanging a pig? Here you'll find the tidy explanation, the one that gets repeated everywhere. It goes like this. Medieval people believed animals had souls and a sense of right and wrong, so a pig that killed a child had genuinely sinned and deserved to be punished for it, exactly like a person. It's a clean, satisfying answer. It makes the whole thing sound like simple medieval superstition. There's just one problem with it. Here's where that tidy story falls apart. Because when historians actually dig into it, they don't agree that it's that simple, and some push back hard. If the whole point was that animals were dumb beasts beneath humans, why dress one in a person's clothes, in a courtroom, and give it a lawyer? That's not treating it like a beast. That's treating it like one of us. One leading historian, Esther Cohen, points straight at that contradiction. Others, like Paul Friedland, argue the trials weren't about the animal's guilt at all. They were about the people watching. So the honest answer is that we don't fully know, and anyone who tells you it was just they thought pigs could sin is handing you a guess dressed up as a fact. What most historians do agree on is stranger and more human than superstition. A medieval village was a fragile place. A child had been killed. The world felt broken and out of order, and people needed that order put back. A crime demanded a trial. A trial demanded a verdict. Leaving the killer unpunished, even when the killer was a pig, left a wound nobody could close. So the trial wasn't about whether the pig understood anything. It was a ritual, a way of standing up in public and declaring that the rules still held, that justice still worked, that wrongs still got answered. The pig was almost beside the point. The trial was for the living. And that's just the first kind of trial. The second was even odder because it went after animals you couldn't put in a dock if you tried. Rats, weevils, locusts, swarms of insects eating the crops down to the stalk. You can't arrest a plague of locusts, so these cases didn't go to the ordinary courts at all. They went to the church, and the church reached for its own weapons. It would formally summon the creatures to appear, and if they refused, it threatened them with a curse. Now, people often say the insects were excommunicated, but that's not quite right, and it's worth getting straight. The church held you couldn't excommunicate something that had never been baptized, so instead it used a curse called an anathema, a solemn command for the creatures to leave the fields or be damned. Which leads to my favorite case of all. A little after the height of the pig trials, in the early 1500s, so just past the medieval line we usually draw, a French town was overrun with rats eating the barley. The rats were summoned to court, and defending them fell to a young lawyer named Bartholomew Chassenet. He could have phoned it in. He didn't. When his clients failed to appear, he argued the summons hadn't been properly delivered because, to be fair, it would have to reach every single rat in the region, which was impossible. When the court tried again, he argued his clients would love to attend but couldn't travel safely because the roads were full of cats. He was, in effect, demanding the court guarantee his clients safe passage from their own predators, and it worked well enough that he built a career on it. He turned a joke of a case into a real argument about legal procedure. Which brings us back to that rooster and the strangest logic in the whole story. In Basel, in 1474, a rooster was burned for laying an egg. On the face of it, that's the dumbest sentence in this video. And you're right to laugh, because a rooster can't lay an egg. It doesn't have the plumbing for it. What the people of Basel almost certainly saw was either a hen that had sickened and started to look and act like a rooster, growing a comb and even crowing, or one of those tiny, yolkless eggs a hen sometimes drops, blamed on the nearest cockerel. But that impossibility was the whole problem. A rooster laying an egg wasn't just strange to them. It was unnatural, a crack in the order of the world. And that is exactly what made it terrifying. But listen to what they actually feared. People believed that when a rooster laid an egg, and they were certain it happened, that egg could hatch a creature called a cockatrice, or a basilisk, a monster, part rooster and part serpent, so venomous it could kill you with a single glance. So look at it through their eyes. This wasn't a town punishing a chicken for being a chicken. This was a town that believed it had a loaded weapon sitting in a barn, an egg that might hatch something that could kill on sight. Burning it wasn't stupidity. Given what they thought was true, it was almost caution. And this is the part that's genuinely uncomfortable, because these punishments were meant to be watched. An execution in the Middle Ages was public theater, a lesson delivered to a crowd, and the animals got the full performance. The condemned pig was paraded to the square in front of the whole village. In some cases, the records say the animal was struck and injured first, hurt in the same part of the body where it had hurt its victim, an eye for an eye, before it was hanged. It's grim, but it tells you exactly what the trial was for. Nobody was doing this to teach the pig a lesson. They were doing it to teach each other one. So here's the full picture. For centuries, across Europe, animals were dragged into real courtrooms, with real judges, real lawyers, and real sentences. Pigs were hanged for killing children, rats were summoned and cursed for eating the harvest. A rooster was burned over an egg people feared could hatch a monster. And it wasn't because medieval people were too stupid to tell a pig from a person. In a lot of ways, they knew exactly what they were doing. The trial was never for the animal. It was a way of taking a world that had gone wrong and forcing it back into shape, out loud, in public, where everyone could see the rules still held. And that's the part worth sitting with. Because it's tempting to feel superior to all this, to file it under things foolish people did a long time ago. But look a little closer, and it isn't as far from you as you'd like. When something senseless happens today, a tragedy with no one really to blame, we still hold hearings. We still open inquiries. We still stand up in a courtroom and demand that someone, or something, be held to account because the alternative, a world where terrible things just happen and nobody answers for them, is unbearable. Medieval people put a pig in the dock for the same reason you'd want an answer. Not because they thought the pig was listening, but because they couldn't stand to live in a world where nobody was. And that need to make sense of the senseless is one thing that hasn't changed in 600 years at all. If you liked this video, leave a like and subscribe. See you next time.